In a quiet, unassuming neighborhood on the edge of a bustling city, life moved at its own unhurried pace. The streets were lined with modest houses, their paint peeling from years of weathering, and small gardens that hinted at the care, or lack thereof, of their owners. It was here, in this humble setting, that Walter Doc Johnson began his day as he always did. At 72 years old, Doc was a man who carried himself with a quiet dignity that seemed almost out of place in today's world. His once strong frame now bore the marks of time. A slight stoop in his shoulders, a slow gait caused by an old injury, and hands that trembled just a little when he reached for something. But despite these signs of age, there was a steadiness about him, a calmness that came from years of experience, both good and bad. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Doc. He was the kind of person who nodded politely when passing strangers, offered a helping hand to those in need, and kept mostly to himself. This particular morning started like any other. Doc woke up early, as was his habit, and shuffled into the kitchen to make himself a cup of coffee. The aroma filled the small house, mingling with the faint scent of oil and grease that still lingered from his days as a mechanic. After retiring decades ago, Doc had turned his attention to simpler pleasures, tending to his garden, reading books, borrowed from the library, and taking long, leisurely walks around the block. These walks were more than just exercise. They were a way for him to stay connected to the world outside his front door. By 8 a.m., Doc was dressed in his usual outfit, a faded flannel shirt tucked into slightly worn slacks, paired with sturdy shoes that had seen better days. He grabbed his grocery bag, which contained a loaf of bread, some fresh vegetables, and a can of soup, and headed out the door. The air was crisp, carrying with it the promise of another sunny day. Birds chirped cheerfully in the trees, and the distant hum of traffic provided a soothing backdrop to the otherwise peaceful scene. As Doc made his way down the sidewalk, he noticed a group of young men loitering near the corner store. They weren't exactly strangers. Most people in the neighborhood recognized them as troublemakers, but they weren't regulars on this particular street either. There were 3 of them, all in their late teens or early 20s, dressed in baggy clothes and baseball caps tilted low over their foreheads. One of them leaned casually against the lamppost, while another sat on the curb, scrolling through his phone. The third stood slightly apart, smoking a cigarette and laughing loudly at something one of the others had said. Doc slowed his pace ever so slightly as he approached them. He didn't want to appear nervous or afraid. He'd faced far worse in his lifetime, but he couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling creeping into the pit of his stomach. Trouble often followed these kinds of kids, and he hoped today wouldn't be the day it spilled over onto him. Still, he reminded himself that appearances could be deceiving. Maybe they were just bored teenagers blowing off steam. Maybe they weren't looking for trouble at all. But as fate would have it, trouble found Doc instead. When he was within a few feet of the group, one of the young men, Marcus, though Doc didn't know his name yet, stepped directly into his path. Marcus was tall and wiry, with sharp features and a cocky grin that suggested he enjoyed pushing boundaries. "Hey, Pops," he called out, his tone mocking. "Where you off to in such a hurry?" Doc stopped walking and looked up at him. His expression remained neutral, betraying none of the unease he felt. "Just heading home," he replied evenly. His voice was soft but firm, carrying a weight that only those who truly listened could detect. Marcus smirked and took a step closer. "Home, huh? What's in the bag?" Without waiting for an answer, he reached out and gave Doc a light shove. It wasn't hard enough to knock him over, but it was forceful enough to make his point clear. The contents of Doc's grocery bag tumbled to the ground, a loaf of bread landing awkwardly, a carrot rolling away, and the can of soup clattering noisily against the pavement. The other 2 laughed, clearly enjoying the spectacle. "Yeah, old man. What you got in there?" "Gold." "Bars?" One of them jeered, his words dripping with sarcasm. For a moment, Doc simply stood there, watching as his carefully chosen groceries scattered across the sidewalk. Then, without saying a word, he bent down slowly to pick them up. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as if he were trying to convey that their antics didn't bother him. Inside, however, memories stirred. Memories of battles fought not just overseas, but also right here in his own country. Memories of being treated as less than human because of the color of his skin. Memories of standing tall in the face of adversity, refusing to let anyone break him. As he gathered the last item, the can of soup, Marcus stepped forward again, this time grabbing Doc's arm roughly. "You deaf or something? I asked you." "A question," he demanded, his voice rising. Doc finally looked up, meeting Marcus's gaze squarely. For the first time since the encounter began, there was a flicker of emotion in his eyes. Not fear, but something deeper, something that sent a shiver down Marcus's spine, though he couldn't quite explain why. "You boys want to know what I've got?" Doc said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Well, let me tell you something. Some things are worth more than gold." And with that, the stage was set for a confrontation that neither side could have anticipated. Little did the thugs know, they were about to learn a lesson they'd never forget, one that would change not only their perception of the elderly man before them, but also the course of their own lives. The tension in the air was palpable as Marcus tightened his grip on Doc's arm, his smirk faltering just slightly. The laughter from his friends died down, replaced by a mix of curiosity and unease. Something about the way Doc spoke, calm, measured yet laced with an authority that seemed out of place for someone his age, made them pause. It wasn't fear exactly, but more like the feeling you get when you're about to step into unfamiliar territory. Doc didn't flinch. Instead, he gently pulled his arm free from Marcus's grasp, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He straightened up, standing as tall as his aging body would allow, and fixed Marcus with a steady gaze. There was no anger in his eyes, no hint of aggression, just a quiet resolve that made Marcus take half a step back, though he quickly masked it by crossing his arms over his chest. "Let me tell you something," Doc said again, his voice low but carrying enough weight to silence even the distant hum of traffic. "I've seen things in my life that would make your head spin. Things that would make this little game you're playing right now seem like child's play." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "But I'm not here to scare you. I'm just trying to remind you that respect goes a long way. And if you don't learn that lesson now, life has a funny way of teaching it to you later." Marcus frowned, clearly unsure how to respond. His two friends exchanged glances, their earlier bravado fading into uncertainty. One of them, the one who had been scrolling through his phone, shifted uncomfortably where he sat on the curb. The other, the tallest of the trio, leaned against the lamppost and crossed his legs, trying to look nonchalant but failing miserably. None of them were used to being talked to like this, especially not by someone they thought would be an easy target. "You think you're tough, huh?" Marcus finally blurted out, his tone defensive. "What are you gonna do, old man? Call the cops on us?" Doc chuckled softly, the sound surprising everyone, including himself. It wasn't a laugh of amusement, but rather one of irony. "Son," he said, shaking his head slightly, "I've been dealing with people like you long before you were even born. Calling the cops won't solve anything. What you need isn't punishment, it's understanding." At this point, Marcus's frustration bubbled over. "Understanding? What's there to understand? You're just some old guy walking around like you own the place." He gestured wildly at Doc, his voice rising. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through." Doc tilted his head slightly, studying Marcus with an intensity that made the young man squirm under his gaze. "Maybe I don't," he admitted. "But I can see pain in your eyes, son. Pain and anger. Those are feelings I know all too well." He paused, giving Marcus a moment to process his words. "And unless you figure out how to channel those emotions into something constructive, they're going to eat you alive." For a split second, Marcus looked genuinely surprised. No one had ever spoken to him like this before. Not teachers, not family members, certainly not random strangers on the street. Most adults either ignored him or treated him like a lost cause. But Doc was different. There was something about the way he carried himself, the way he spoke with such conviction that made Marcus question whether this encounter was really about spilled groceries after all. "Look," Marcus muttered, running a hand through his hair as if trying to shake off the strange emotions swirling inside him. "We were just messing around, okay? No harm done." "No harm done?" Doc repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Is that what you call shoving an old man and scattering his groceries across the sidewalk? Because if that's your idea of harmless fun, then maybe it's time you reevaluate your priorities." The tallest of the three thugs snickered nervously, earning a sharp glare from Marcus. "Shut up, Jay," he snapped before turning back to Doc. "Fine, whatever. We'll leave you alone. Happy now?" Doc shook his head slowly, his expression unreadable. "Leaving me alone isn't the issue here. The issue is learning to treat others with kindness and respect, regardless of who they are or where they come from. That's a lesson that'll serve you better than any excuse you can cook up." Marcus opened his mouth to retort, but found himself at a loss for words. For the first time in a long while, he felt exposed, vulnerable even. This wasn't supposed to happen. They were just supposed to rough up some old guy and move on with their day, but instead, they'd stumbled into a conversation that felt heavier, more meaningful than anything they'd experienced in years. As the standoff continued, Doc decided to change tactics. He bent down once more to retrieve the last of his scattered items, a crumpled plastic bag, and placed everything neatly back into it. Then, without warning, he reached into the pocket of his flannel shirt and pulled out a small, weathered photograph. Holding it up so the three young men could see, he said simply, "This is who I am." The photo showed a much younger version of Doc, standing alongside a group of soldiers in camouflage uniforms. Behind them loomed dense jungle foliage and, in the distance, smoke rose from what appeared to be a battlefield. The insignia on their sleeves was unmistakable, the U.S. Army's 101st Airborne Division. "You served?" the tallest thug asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "In Vietnam?" Doc nodded, tucking the photograph back into his pocket. "Yes, I did, and let me tell you, those days weren't easy. We faced enemies we couldn't always see, fought battles that tested every ounce of our strength and courage. But the hardest part wasn't the war itself. It was coming home to a country that didn't always appreciate what we'd done. Especially for men like me, men of color." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The three young men exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado completely gone. For the first time, they realized they weren't dealing with just any ordinary senior citizen. This was a man who had lived through hell and survived, a man who had earned the right to speak with authority. "I'm not telling you this to impress you," Doc added, sensing their shift in attitude. "I'm telling you because I want you to understand something important. Life is full of challenges, yes, but it's also full of opportunities to grow, to learn, to become better versions of yourselves. Don't waste those opportunities on petty nonsense like this." Marcus swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. He glanced at his friends, silently pleading for guidance, but they were just as lost as he was. Finally, he turned back to Doc and muttered almost reluctantly, "Okay, I hear you, we messed up, sorry." It wasn't the most eloquent apology, but it was sincere, and for Doc, that was enough. The apology hung in the air, simple yet significant. Marcus's words might not have been perfect, but they carried a weight that Doc could feel. It was a small victory, a crack in the wall of bravado and indifference these young men had built around themselves. Still, Doc knew that apologies were just the beginning. Real change required more than just saying sorry. It required understanding, reflection, and action. Instead of responding immediately, Doc took a deep breath and studied the three young men standing before him. They looked unsure, almost fragile now, as if the armor they wore to face the world had been stripped away. He saw glimpses of their vulnerability, the way Marcus kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other, how Jay nervously scratched the back of his neck, and how the third boy, whose name Doc still didn't know, stared at the ground as though afraid to meet his gaze. "You don't need to apologize to me," Doc finally said, his voice calm but firm. "What matters is what you do next. Do you understand?" Marcus frowned, clearly confused. "What do you mean? We said we're sorry. Isn't that enough?" Doc shook his head slowly, a faint smile playing on his lips. Sorry is a start, son, but it's not the finish line. Words are cheap unless they're backed by actions. If you really want to make things right, not just with me, but with yourselves, then you've got to put in the work. The tallest thug, Jay, spoke up hesitantly. What kind of work? Doc considered the question for a moment before answering. Let me tell you a story, he began, gesturing for them to sit down on the curb. To his surprise, they complied without argument, their earlier hostility replaced by curiosity. Even Marcus, who had seemed so defiant moments ago, settled onto the concrete with a wary expression. When I came home from Vietnam, Doc continued, I wasn't the same man who left. War changes you. It breaks you down and forces you to rebuild yourself piece by piece. But here's the thing. When I got back, no one wanted to hear my stories. People didn't care about what I'd seen or done over there. All they saw was a black man in a uniform, and that was enough for some folks to treat me like I didn't belong. He paused, letting the gravity of his words settle over the group. The three young men listened intently, their usual cockiness replaced by rapt attention. This wasn't the kind of conversation they were used to having, and it showed in the way they leaned forward slightly, eager to hear more. I worked hard to build a life for myself after the war, Doc went on. I became a mechanic because it gave me purpose. It let me fix things that were broken, whether it was cars or relationships. And along the way, I learned something important. Everyone has scars, even if you can't see them. Some people wear their pain on the surface while others bury it deep inside. But pain is pain, no matter where it comes from. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the others before returning to Doc. Are you saying we're hurting too? Doc nodded. Exactly. You might act tough, but I can see the cracks beneath the surface. Life hasn't been easy for you boys, has it? Silence followed his question, thick and heavy. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Then Marcus sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. No, it hasn't. My dad left when I was a kid, and my mom works 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. School feels pointless, and nobody expects anything from me anyway. So why bother trying? His admission surprised, even himself. He hadn't planned to share so much, but something about Doc's presence made it feel safe to open up. The old man didn't judge him or interrupt. He simply listened, nodding occasionally as if to encourage Marcus to keep going. That's a lot to carry, Doc said gently. But you're stronger than you think, son. Pain doesn't define you. It shapes you. What defines you is how you choose to respond to it. Jay chimed in then, his voice hesitant. My dad was a vet too. He died before I was born, so I never got to meet him. Sometimes I wonder what he was like, if he'd be proud of me or disappointed. Doc's expression softened. Your father sounds like a brave man, and I'm sure he'd be proud of you. Jay, especially if you decide to honor his memory by making better choices. You don't have to follow in anyone else's footsteps, you can carve your own path. The third boy, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. What about you? He asked quietly. Were you proud of what you did in the war? Doc smiled wistfully, the lines on his face deepening as he thought back to those days. There were moments when I felt proud. Yes, but there were also moments when I questioned everything. My decisions, my role in the war, my place in the world. War isn't glamorous no matter what movies might show you. It's messy and complicated, and it leaves scars that never fully heal. He paused, looking each of them in the eye. But here's the lesson I want you to take away. Life is messy too. It throws challenges at you that you can't always control. What you can control is how you react to those challenges. Will you let them break you, or will you use them to grow stronger? The 3 young men sat in silence, absorbing Doc's words. For the first time in a long while, they weren't thinking about how to look cool or tough. Instead, they were reflecting on their lives, their choices, and the futures they wanted to create for themselves. After a few minutes, Marcus cleared his throat. So, what should we do now? Doc grinned, a spark of mischief lighting up his weathered features. Well, for starters, you can help me pick up the rest of my groceries. After that, maybe we can talk about finding ways to turn your energy into something positive. There's plenty of work to be done around here, gardening, fixing things, mentoring kids. The neighborhood could use some heroes. The word heroes caught their attention. None of them had ever thought of themselves in that light before. Heroes were supposed to be fearless, invincible, larger-than-life figures, not ordinary kids from the wrong side of town. Yet, as they looked at Doc, the man who had faced death and discrimination and come out stronger, they began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, they could rise to the challenge. "All right," Marcus said finally, standing up and brushing dirt off his jeans. "Let's start with the groceries." And with that, the unlikely bond between an elderly veteran and three troubled youths began to take shape. Little did they know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would change all of their lives forever. Over the next few weeks, something remarkable began to happen in the neighborhood. The three young men, Marcus, Jay, and the quieter one named Devin, started showing up at Doc's house almost every day. At first, it was just small gestures, helping him carry groceries inside, mowing his overgrown lawn, or fixing the squeaky gate that had annoyed him for years. But as time went on, their involvement deepened. They weren't just doing chores, they were learning, growing, and slowly transforming into versions of themselves they hadn't thought possible. Doc became more than just a neighbor to them. He became a mentor, a guide, and in many ways the father figure none of them had ever truly known. He didn't preach or lecture. Instead, he shared stories from his life, some funny, some heartbreaking, and all deeply human. Through these tales, he taught them lessons about resilience, responsibility, and the importance of treating others with kindness. One afternoon, as the four of them sat together on Doc's porch sipping lemonade, Marcus brought up a question that had been weighing on his mind. "Doc," he said hesitantly, "how do you keep going when everything feels pointless? Like, what's the point of trying if nobody cares anyway?" Doc leaned back in his chair, letting the question hang in the air for a moment. Then, with a thoughtful expression, he replied, "That's a good question, Marcus. A lot of people ask themselves that same thing, especially when life gets tough. But here's what I've learned. The world may not always notice your efforts, but you will. Every little thing you do adds up, whether it's helping someone cross the street, planting a tree, or even just smiling at a stranger. Those small actions might seem insignificant, but they matter, and eventually they add up to something bigger." Devin, who rarely spoke, chimed in softly. "But what if you mess up? What if you try and fail?" Doc smiled warmly. "Failure is part of the process, son. Nobody gets it right the first time or the second or the 10th. The key is to keep moving forward. Failing doesn't make you weak. Giving up does. You learn more from your mistakes than you ever do from your successes." To illustrate his point, Doc stood up and walked over to a toolbox sitting near the railing. He pulled out an old wrench and held it up for them to see. "This wrench has been through hell," he said with a chuckle. "It's dented, scratched, and worn down from years of use. But it still works. It hasn't given up, and neither should you." The boys nodded, each taking in his words in their own way. For Marcus, it was a reminder that setbacks weren't the end of the road. They were just bumps along the way. For Jay, it reinforced the idea that effort mattered more than perfection. And for Devin, it sparked a quiet determination to push past his doubts and fears. As the days turned into weeks, Doc introduced the trio to other veterans at the local VFW hall. Many of these men and women were older, their bodies bearing the scars of wars fought decades ago. Some walked with canes, while others sat in wheelchairs, but their spirits remained unbroken. They welcomed Marcus, Jay, and Devin with open arms, sharing their own stories of struggle and triumph. At first, the boys felt out of place among the veterans, unsure of how to act or what to say. But soon they realized that these men and women weren't so different from them. They too had faced hardships, made mistakes, and struggled to find their place in the world. Hearing their experiences gave the boys a newfound perspective on life. and on themselves. One evening, during a casual gathering at the VFW, a veteran named Sam told a story that left a lasting impression on the group. Sam had served in Korea and returned home to find himself struggling to adjust to civilian life. He'd battled depression, anger, and feelings of isolation for years before finally seeking help. "I won't lie to you," he admitted, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "There were nights when I wanted to give up, but then I remembered something my sergeant used to say. You're stronger than you think, and braver than you feel." That line kept me going when nothing else could. Marcus, Jay, and Devin listened intently, their faces reflecting a mix of awe and admiration. Afterward, Devin approached Sam shyly and asked, "How did you know when things would get better?" Sam placed a reassuring hand on Devin's shoulder. "Things don't always get better overnight, kid. Sometimes it's a slow process, like climbing a mountain one step at a time, but every step counts, no matter how small. And having people around who believe in you makes all the difference." Back at Doc's house later that night, the boys reflected on what they'd heard. "I never knew vets went through so much after the war," Marcus admitted, his tone softer than usual. "I mean, I figured it must have been hard, but hearing them talk about it, it made me realize how lucky we are to have guys like Doc looking out for us." Jay nodded in agreement. "Yeah, and not just Doc. All those people at the VFW, they're tough, but they care. They want us to succeed," Devin added quietly. "They remind me that it's okay to ask for help. I always thought asking meant weakness, but now I see it's actually strength." Their conversations grew deeper as the weeks passed, touching on topics they'd never dared to discuss before: family, dreams, regrets, and hopes for the future. Doc encouraged them to dream big, but also to take practical steps toward achieving their goals. When Marcus expressed interest in finishing high school, Doc helped him enroll in a GED program. When Jay mentioned wanting to learn carpentry, Doc connected him with a retired builder who needed an apprentice. And when Devin revealed his love for drawing, Doc surprised him with a sketchpad and pencils, urging him to explore his talent. Through it all, the boys began to change, not overnight, but gradually. Their once cocky attitudes softened into confidence. Their reckless behavior transformed into purposeful action. Neighbors noticed the shift too. Where once the trio had been seen as troublemakers, they were now viewed as helpers, protectors, and role models for younger kids in the community. One Saturday morning, as they worked together to clean up a vacant lot that had become a dumping ground, Marcus looked around at the others and smiled. "You know," he said, wiping sweat from his brow, "this isn't half bad. Feels kinda good to do something positive for a change." Doc chuckled, leaning on his rake. "See, I told you, helping others helps you too. It's like planting seeds. You might not see the results right away, but trust me, they'll grow." And grow they did. As the months rolled by, the bond between Doc and the three young men only strengthened. What started as a chance encounter on the sidewalk blossomed into a relationship built on mutual respect, understanding, and hope. Though none of them could predict exactly where this journey would lead, one thing was certain: they were all becoming better versions of themselves, one step at a time. Months had passed since that fateful morning when Marcus, Jay, and Devin first crossed paths with Doc. The neighborhood was beginning to notice a change, not just in the three young men, but in the entire community. What started as small acts of kindness and responsibility had grown into something much larger, a ripple effect of positivity that spread far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. Marcus, once known for skipping school and causing trouble, now spent his afternoons studying at the local library. He'd enrolled in the GED program, determined to earn his diploma and prove to himself and to Doc that he was capable of more than he'd ever imagined. At first, it wasn't easy. Sitting in a classroom felt foreign to him, and the material often seemed overwhelming. But every time he wanted to give up, he remembered Doc's words: "Failing doesn't make you weak. Giving up does." Those words became his mantra, pushing him to keep going even when the road ahead felt uncertain. Jay, meanwhile, had found his calling in carpentry. Under the guidance of Mr. Henderson, the retired builder Doc introduced him to, Jay discovered a natural talent for working with his hands. Together they repaired fences, built shelves, and even constructed a new playground for the neighborhood kids. Each project brought Jay a sense of accomplishment he'd never experienced before. For the first time in his life, he felt proud of the work he was doing, and more importantly, he realized that pride didn't come from showing off or acting tough. It came from creating something meaningful, something that would last. Devin, the quietest of the trio, was blossoming in his own way. With Doc's encouragement, he began sketching portraits of the people around him, friends, neighbors, veterans at the VFW hall. His drawings captured not just their faces, but their personalities. The wisdom in Sam's eyes, the warmth in Mrs. Thompson's smile, the resilience in Doc's weathered features. When Devin finally worked up the courage to show his sketches, to others the response was overwhelmingly positive. Someone suggested he enter an art contest, and though he was hesitant at first, he decided to take the leap. To everyone's delight, Devin won second place, earning not only recognition but also a newfound confidence in his abilities. As the boys continued to grow, so did their impact on the neighborhood. They organized cleanup days, turning vacant lots into vibrant green spaces where children could play safely. They helped elderly residents with household repairs, painted murals on walls that had once been covered in graffiti, and even started a mentorship program for younger kids who were struggling in school. Their efforts inspired others to join in, creating a sense of unity and purpose that hadn't existed before. But perhaps the most profound change was within themselves. Gone were the days of reckless behavior and aimless wandering. In its place was a clarity of purpose, a desire to contribute, to make a difference, and to honor the lessons Doc had taught them. They no longer saw themselves as outsiders or troublemakers. They saw themselves as leaders, protectors, and role models. One crisp autumn afternoon, the four of them gathered on Doc's porch, as they often did, to reflect on how far they'd come. The air smelled of fallen leaves, and the golden sunlight bathed everything in a warm glow. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a satisfied grin spreading across his face. "You know," he said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I used to think I was stuck, like there was no way out of the mess I was in. But now, I feel like I'm actually headed somewhere." Doc nodded approvingly. "That's because you are, son. Every choice you make takes you closer to the person you want to become. And look at you, all three of you, you're proving that change is possible." Jay chimed in, his voice filled with gratitude. "We couldn't have done it without you, Doc. You didn't just teach us stuff. You believed in us. Even when we didn't believe in ourselves," Devin added softly. "And you showed us that it's okay to ask for help. That asking isn't weakness, it's strength." Doc smiled, his eyes twinkling with pride. "You boys have come a long way, and I'm honored to have been part of your journey. But remember this. The real credit goes to you. You're the ones putting in the effort, making the sacrifices, and choosing to do better every single day." The conversation shifted to plans for the future. Marcus talked excitedly about finishing his GED and maybe even enrolling in community college. Jay shared his dream of starting his own carpentry business someday, while Devin expressed interest in pursuing art professionally. As they spoke, their excitement was contagious, filling the air with hope and possibility. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Marcus turned to Doc with a thoughtful expression. "Doc, do you ever wonder if we'll be able to make a difference like you did? Like, will people remember us the way we remember you?" Doc chuckled softly, leaning forward in his chair. "Son, making a difference isn't about being remembered. It's about touching lives, big or small, in ways that matter. Some of those lives might be strangers and some might be your own. The important thing is that you try, because when you touch one life, it ripples outward, affecting countless others." He paused, looking each of them in the eye. "Take me, for example. I never set out to change the world. I just tried to live my life with integrity and kindness, and somehow along the way I ended up changing yours. Who knows? Maybe one day you'll change someone else's life too." The simplicity of his words struck a chord with the boys. They realized that greatness wasn't measured by fame or fortune. It was measured by the connections you forged, the love you gave, and the legacy you left behind. As the night grew cooler, they lingered on the porch a little longer, savoring the moment. There was still much work to be done, both in their personal lives and in the community. But for now, they allowed themselves to bask in the progress they'd made, the friendships they'd formed, the challenges they'd overcome, and the promise of brighter days ahead. Unbeknownst to them, their story was already spreading throughout the neighborhood. Parents whispered about the transformation of those boys over dinner tables. Teachers noticed improvements in their attitudes and grades. Even the local newspaper ran a feature on their community projects highlighting their dedication and teamwork. Slowly but surely, Marcus, Jay, and Devin were becoming symbols of hope, not just for themselves but for everyone around them. And through it all, Doc watched with quiet satisfaction. He knew that his role in their lives wasn't just about teaching lessons or offering advice. It was about planting seeds of potential, growth, and possibility, and trusting that they would bloom into something beautiful. The seasons changed, and so did the neighborhood. What had once been a place marked by neglect and indifference was now alive with energy and purpose. The transformation wasn't just visible in the freshly painted walls or the newly planted trees. It was felt in the air, in the smiles of neighbors, and in the laughter of children playing in the park. At the heart of this change were Marcus, Jay, Devin, and Doc, whose bond had grown into something unbreakable. One evening, as the sun set in fiery hues of orange and pink, the four of them gathered on Doc's porch for one of their regular talks. The conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from future plans to fond memories of the past few months. But there was a quiet undercurrent to the discussion, a sense that they were approaching a turning point. "You know, Marcus," began, his voice thoughtful, "I've been thinking about something. All this time you've been helping us, teaching us, guiding us, but what about you, Doc? What do you want?" Doc raised an eyebrow, amused by the question. "What do I want? Well, let me tell you, son. I already have more than I ever dreamed of watching you boys grow, seeing the positive impact you're making. That's worth more to me than anything money can buy." But Marcus shook his head, not satisfied with the answer. "No, seriously, you've given us so much. Isn't there something we can do for you?" Jay nodded eagerly. "Yeah, Doc. You've done so much for everyone else. It's our turn to give back." Devin added softly. "We owe you, Doc. Big time." For a moment, Doc sat quietly, considering their words. Then he smiled, a warm and knowing smile that reached his eyes. "All right then," he said finally. "If you really want to do something for me, here's my wish. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep growing, keep learning, and keep spreading kindness wherever you go. That's all I need." The simplicity of his request struck a chord with the boys. It wasn't about grand gestures or material gifts. It was about continuing the legacy of compassion and resilience that Doc had instilled in them. And yet, they couldn't shake the feeling that there must be something more they could do to honor him. The following week, the trio hatched a plan. They enlisted the help of neighbors, veterans from the VFW Hall, and even some local businesses to organize a special event, a community celebration in Doc's honor. Flyers went up around the neighborhood, inviting everyone to join in, recognizing the man who had quietly transformed lives without expecting anything in return. On the day of the event, the small park near Doc's house buzzed with activity. Tables were set up with food donated by local restaurants, while a stage hosted performances by kids from the neighborhood. Veterans stood proudly alongside families, sharing stories and laughter. Streamers fluttered in the breeze, and a banner, stretched across the entrance, read, "Thank you, Doc, for everything." When Doc arrived, escorted by Marcus, Jay, and Devin, the crowd erupted into applause. His eyes widened in surprise as he took in the scene before him. "What is all this?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. It's for you, Doc, Marcus said, grinning ear to ear. You've done so much for us, for everyone here. We just wanted to say thank you. Tears welled up in Doc's eyes as he looked around at the faces of his friends and neighbors. He saw Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman whose fence he'd helped repair countless times, waving enthusiastically. He saw Sam, the Korean War veteran who had shared his story with the boys, standing tall despite his cane. And he saw Marcus, Jay, and Devin, his protégés, his family, beaming with pride. I don't know what to say, Doc admitted, his voice choked with gratitude. This means more to me than you'll ever know. As the celebration continued, speeches were made, songs were sung, and stories were shared. One by one, people stepped forward to express their appreciation for Doc, not just for his actions, but for the person he was. A kind-hearted man who had chosen to see the good in others, even when it wasn't easy. A wise mentor who had believed in people when they couldn't believe in themselves. A hero who had lived quietly among them, leaving an indelible mark on every life he touched. Later that evening, as the festivities wound down and the crowd began to disperse, Doc found himself sitting alone on a bench overlooking the park. The stars twinkled above, casting a soft glow over the scene. For a moment, he allowed himself to reflect on everything that had happened, the journey he'd taken with Marcus, Jay, and Devin, and the ripple effect it had created throughout the community. He thought about the lessons he'd tried to impart. The importance of respect, the value of hard work, the power of kindness. And he realized that these lessons hadn't just changed the boys, they had changed him too. Through their growth, he had rediscovered parts of himself he thought he'd lost long ago. Hope, purpose, and joy. As if sensing his solitude, Marcus, Jay, and Devin approached quietly and sat beside him. None of them spoke. They simply sat together, enjoying the peacefulness of the night. After a while, Devin broke the silence. Doc, he said softly, do you think we'll ever be like you? Like, will we ever make the kind of difference you've made? Doc chuckled, placing a reassuring hand on Devin's shoulder. Son, you already are. Every act of kindness, every effort to improve yourself or help someone else, you're making a difference. And trust me, it adds up faster than you think. Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the stars. It's crazy, isn't it? A year ago, I never would have imagined any of this. Now look at us, look at the neighborhood. Jay grinned. Yeah, and we're just getting started. They sat there for a little longer, letting the weight of their accomplishments settle over them. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would still be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But they faced those uncertainties with confidence, knowing they weren't alone. They had each other, and they had Doc. Eventually, they rose from the bench and walked back toward Doc's house, their footsteps falling in sync. As they reached the front door, Doc turned to them with a smile. You boys remember this, he said. Life is a gift, and every day is an opportunity to make it count. Don't waste it. With that, he stepped inside, leaving the three young men standing on the porch. They exchanged glances, each silently acknowledging the truth in Doc's words. Then, without saying a word, they headed home, ready to continue the work they'd started, to build brighter futures for themselves and for the world around them. And so, the legacy of Walter Doc Johnson lived on, not just in the stories people told, but in the lives he had touched and the values he had passed down. In the end, it wasn't medals or accolades that defined him. It was the quiet strength, unwavering compassion, and enduring belief in the goodness of others that made him truly unforgettable.